The longing to go on a pilgrimage is deeply embedded in human nature. Standing in the places once walked by those we hold in reverence, seeing the very locations where they were born, lived, and died, offers us a sense of mystical connection and serves as a tangible tribute to their memory. If the great figures of history have sacred sites where admirers travel from afar to pay homage, then how much more eagerly do people journey to places believed to have been touched by the divine? In the earliest days of Christianity, pilgrimages were uncommon. Early Christian belief focused more on the divinity and universal presence of Christ than on his human life, and the Roman authorities were not inclined to support travel to Palestine. Jerusalem, destroyed by Titus, lay in ruins until it was rebuilt by Hadrian as the Roman city of Aelia. Yet, Christians never forgot the sacred landscape where Christ's life unfolded. Their deep respect for the site of Calvary was so well known that Hadrian intentionally built a temple to Venus Capitolina on that very spot. By the 3rd century, the cave at Bethlehem was already familiar to many Christians. Devotees also traveled to the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane, and the site of the Ascension. Visiting these sacred locations for prayer and spiritual reward had already become a part of Christian devotion. As Christianity gained prominence, pilgrimages became more common. Emperor Constantine, in embracing the faith, supported its expansion. His mother, Empress Helena, embarked on a journey to Palestine to uncover Calvary and locate relics from the Passion of Christ. Her discoveries were honored by Constantine, who commissioned the construction of a church on the site. That church, despite centuries of change, remains the central shrine of Christianity, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Pilgrims quickly began traveling to the places Helena had explored. While many left no records of their journeys, we know that by the year 333, even before the completion of Helena's excavations, a traveler from Bordeaux made his way to Palestine and documented his trip. Soon after, a determined woman recorded her pilgrimage through the Holy Land. Toward the end of the 4th century, one of the great Latin Church fathers, Saint Jerome, settled in Palestine, drawing with him a group of wealthy and noble women who had once studied under him in Italy. From his cell in Bethlehem, he welcomed a steady stream of visitors who came to honor him after visiting the sacred sites. St. Augustine, one of the most spiritually profound Western fathers, viewed pilgrimages as unnecessary or even harmful. Many of the Eastern Greek fathers shared this opinion. St. Jerome, however, while not claiming that living in Jerusalem held any spiritual benefit, argued that praying where Christ once stood was an act of faith. His perspective proved more appealing to the broader public than Augustine's. As a result, pilgrimages increased, receiving encouragement from church and imperial authorities alike. By the early 5th century, it was said that Jerusalem and its surroundings hosted as many as 200 monasteries and guest houses built to accommodate pilgrims. By the middle of the 5th century, the early enthusiasm for Jerusalem reached its peak. Empress Eudocia, daughter of a pagan philosopher from Athens, chose to settle in Jerusalem after a troubled life at the imperial court. Accompanied by devout members of the Byzantine aristocracy, she immersed herself in religious pursuits. Between composing hymns, she became an active supporter of the growing trend of relic collection. She helped lay the foundation for Constantinople's famed relic collection by sending there what was believed to be a portrait of the Virgin Mary, painted by St. Luke. Her actions inspired not only pilgrims from Constantinople, but also from the West. For centuries, the luxuries of the material world had flowed from the East. Now, religious treasures began to follow the same path. Christianity had its roots in the East, and most of the early saints and martyrs came from that region. As devotion to saints became more widespread, influential voices like Prudentius and Ennodius preached that divine help could be found at saints' tombs, and that their remains were capable of working miracles. People began to travel great distances to see sacred relics. The most important relics remained in the East. Those of Christ stayed in Jerusalem until later moved to Constantinople, while most saints' relics stayed near their original homelands. Still, lesser relics gradually made their way to the west. Eventually, even small fragments of major relics were transported westward, followed by entire major relics themselves. This religious movement further drew the West's attention to the East. The people of Langres, proud owners of a finger of St. Mamas, were naturally drawn to visit his hometown of Caesarea in Cappadocia. The nuns as Chamaliers, who possessed the bones of St. Thecla, became personally invested in her birthplace at Isaurian Seleucia. When a woman from Orient returned from her journey with the thumb of St. John the Baptist, her peers were inspired to visit his body in Samaria and his head in Damascus. Entire diplomatic missions were sometimes dispatched in hopes of acquiring such treasures. Churches in the West were increasingly named after Eastern saints or sacred places like the Holy Sepulchre, and often a portion of their income was dedicated to supporting the original holy sites from which their names were drawn. This connection between East and West was supported by ongoing Mediterranean trade. Though commerce was gradually declining due to the economic weakening of the West and disruptions like the Vandal piracy that made sea travel dangerous, contact was still maintained. Religious divisions and unrest in the East also presented obstacles. Nevertheless, in the 6th century, many Western pilgrims continued to journey eastward aboard Greek or Syrian merchant vessels. These traders not only transported goods and passengers, but also carried religious stories and updates. Because of such exchanges, Western chroniclers like Gregory of Tours remained well informed about events in the East. One record even tells of a conversation between Saint Simeon Stylites and a Syrian merchant. In this exchange, Saint Simeon inquired about Saint Genevieve of Paris and sent her a personal greeting. Despite theological disputes and political tensions among church leaders, the relationship between Eastern and Western Christians during this time remained strong and full of goodwill. The period of early pilgrimages came to a close with the Arab conquests. Syrian merchants stopped visiting the coasts of France and Italy, bringing with them goods and news. Piracy once again became a threat in the Mediterranean, and the Muslim rulers of Palestine viewed Christian travelers with suspicion. The journey grew both costly and dangerous, and the Western Christian world had little wealth to spare. Still, contact was not completely severed. Christians in the West continued to feel a deep emotional and spiritual connection to the sacred sites of the East. In 682, when Pope Martin I was accused of maintaining friendly relations with Muslims, he justified his actions by saying he sought permission to send charitable donations to Jerusalem. In 670, a Frankish bishop named Arculf embarked on a pilgrimage to the East, successfully touring Egypt, Syria, and Palestine before returning via Constantinople. The entire journey took several years and was filled with hardship. We also know of other pilgrims from this period, such as Wulfi of Roux in Picardy and Burcaire of Monturandre in Burgundy, along with his companion Wymer. Their accounts reveal that only determined and rugged men were capable of making the pilgrimage to Jerusalem at that time. Women did not appear to attempt such journeys. The number of pilgrims began to rise during the 8th century. Some even traveled from England. In his youth, Willibald made a pilgrimage to Palestine, setting out from Rome in 722 and returning only after several difficult years in 729. By the end of the century, there seems to have been an effort to organize pilgrimages under the sponsorship of Charlemagne. He had restored order and relative prosperity to the West and established diplomatic ties with the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. The hostels built with his support in the Holy Land suggest that many pilgrims visited Jerusalem during his reign, including women. Nuns from Christian Spain were even sent to serve at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. However, this wave of pilgrimage was short-lived. The Carolingian Empire declined, and Muslim pirates re-emerged in the eastern Mediterranean, while Norse raiders attacked from the west. When Bernard the Wise of Brittany visited Palestine in 870, he found the facilities built under Charlemagne still standing but empty and falling into ruin. He had only been able to travel by securing a passport from the Muslim rulers of Bari in southern Italy. The golden age of pilgrimage began in the 10th century. Over time, Arab pirates were expelled from their strongholds in Italy and southern France, and in 961, Crete was retaken from them. The Byzantine navy had already begun to assert its control over the seas, reviving maritime commerce across the Mediterranean. Greek and Italian merchant ships moved freely between ports in Italy and the Byzantine Empire and, with the cooperation of Muslim authorities, began to open trade routes to Syria and Egypt. Pilgrims could now more easily secure passage directly from cities like Venice or Bari to Tripoli or Alexandria. Still, many chose to stop first in Constantinople to view its renowned relics before continuing their journey, either by sea or overland. In Palestine, the Muslim rulers generally did not obstruct Christian travelers. On the contrary, they welcomed them, recognizing the economic benefits the pilgrims brought to the region. The improved conditions for pilgrimage had a noticeable impact on religious thinking in the West. It is uncertain when pilgrimages were first mandated as formal penance. Early medieval penitential texts recommended pilgrimages, though they rarely specified particular destinations. However, there was a growing belief that certain holy sites possessed unique spiritual power. For the pilgrim, these journeys offered not only the chance to venerate the physical relics and surroundings associated with God and His saints, fostering a mystical connection, but also the hope of receiving God's forgiveness. From the 10th century onward, pilgrimage destinations were considered especially powerful in this regard. The shrine of St. James at Compostela in Spain, that of St. Michael at Monte Gargano in Italy, the many sacred locations in Rome, and, above all, the holy sites in Palestine. These places were now far more accessible, either due to Muslim retreat or their cooperation. Yet the journey remained long and challenging. Sending a criminal away on a pilgrimage for a year or more distanced him from his crime, and the physical hardship and costs served as a form of penance. The spiritual rewards and the sacred atmosphere at the journey's end provided emotional renewal. He returned transformed. Chroniclers often make passing references to frequent pilgrimages, although the names that survive tend to be those of prominent figures. Among the high-ranking pilgrims were Hilda, Countess of Swabia, who died on her journey in 969, and Judith, Duchess of Bavaria and sister-in-law to Emperor Otto I, who made her pilgrimage in 970. Other noble pilgrims included the Counts of Ardèche, Vienne, Verdun, Arcy, Anhalt, and Gorizia. Senior church figures were even more committed. Saint Conrad, Bishop of Constance, journeyed to Jerusalem 3 times, while Saint John, Bishop of Parma, went there 6 times. The Bishop of Olivola visited in 920. Several abbots made the trip as well. These well-known pilgrims were often accompanied by groups of humble men and women whose names went unrecorded. Most of this activity stemmed from personal initiative. However, a new political and religious force was emerging in Europe. In 910, Count William I of Aquitaine founded the Abbey of Cluny. By the end of the century, Cluny had become the heart of a vast and orderly monastic network, closely aligned with the papacy. The Cluniac movement saw itself as the moral guardian of Western Christendom. Pilgrimage, in their view, was a practice worth supporting. They sought to make it more accessible and better organized. By the early 11th century, Cluny had assumed near total control over the pilgrimages to the major shrines in Spain. At the same time, they began to encourage and promote pilgrimages to Jerusalem. It was at their urging that the abbot of Stavelot traveled to the Holy Land in 990, followed by the Count of Verdun in 997. Cluny's growing influence is reflected in the large number of 11th century pilgrims from France and Lorraine. While there were still many German pilgrims, including the archbishops of Trier and Mainz and the Bishop of Bamberg, and a steady stream of English pilgrims, those from France and Lorraine became dominant. The 2 powerful dynasties of northern France were both close allies of Cluny, despite their rivalry. Both supported journeys to the east. Fulk Nerra, the fierce Count of Anjou, went to Jerusalem in 1002 and returned twice more. Duke Richard III of Normandy sent charitable gifts to the Holy Land, while Duke Robert personally led a massive pilgrimage there in 1035. These events were all faithfully recorded by the Cluniac historian, the monk Glaber. The Normans eagerly followed the example set by their dukes. They held a deep reverence for Saint Michael, and large numbers of them undertook pilgrimages to Monte Gargano. From there, the more adventurous among them would continue their journey to Palestine. By the middle of the 11th century, they made up such a significant and passionate portion of the pilgrims traveling to Palestine that the authorities in Constantinople, upset by Norman incursions into Byzantine territory in Italy, began to treat the pilgrim movement with suspicion. Their Scandinavian relatives displayed a similar fervor. Scandinavians had long visited Constantinople and were captivated by its riches and splendor. Back home, they spoke of the city with awe, even equating it at times with Asgard, the mythical home of the gods. By 930, Norse warriors were already serving in the emperor's army. Early in the 11th century, their numbers had grown large enough to form the renowned Varangian Guard. Many of these Varangians developed the custom of journeying to Jerusalem during their leave. The earliest known instance was a man named Kolskegr, who was in Palestine in 992. Harold Hardrada, the most celebrated of the Varangians, made his pilgrimage in 1034. Throughout the 11th century, numerous Norwegians, Icelanders, and Danes spent years in imperial service, then made pilgrimages to Jerusalem before returning home, enriched by their savings. Inspired by their stories, friends and relatives often traveled south solely for the pilgrimage. Thorvald Kudranson Vidforli, known as the Apostle of Iceland, visited Jerusalem around 990. Some Norse pilgrims even claimed to have seen Olaf Tryggvason, Norway's first Christian king, in Jerusalem following his mysterious disappearance in 1000. Olaf, too, intended to follow in his predecessor's footsteps, but his journey remained only a legend. Many of these Nordic nobles were men of violence, often guilty of murder and in search of spiritual atonement. Sweyn Godwinson, who was half Danish, led a group of Englishmen to Jerusalem in 1051 as penance for a killing. He died of exposure in the Anatolian mountains the following autumn, having made the journey barefoot as a sign of repentance. Lagman Gudrodsson, the Norse king of Man, who had murdered his brother, also sought God's forgiveness through pilgrimage. A typical route favored by Scandinavian pilgrims was a circuitous one. In the 10th century, pilgrims from the west were primarily forced to journey by sea across the Mediterranean to reach Constantinople or Syria. However, sea travel was expensive and available space was limited. In 975, the rulers of Hungary embraced Christianity, opening up an overland route that followed the Danube and crossed the Balkans into Constantinople. This path remained perilous until 1019, when the Byzantine Empire secured control over the entire Balkan region. After that, pilgrims could travel safely through Hungary, enter the Byzantine Empire at Belgrade, and continue through Sofia and Adrianople to the imperial capital. Another option was to travel to Byzantine-controlled southern Italy, then take the short sea crossing from Bari to Dyrrhachium, and follow the ancient Roman Via Egnatia through Thessalonica to the Bosphorus. From there, 3 well-established roads led across Asia Minor to Antioch. The route continued down to the coast at Latakia and into Fatimid territory near Tortosa. This was the only border pilgrims had to cross after arriving at Belgrade or Tamoli, and from that point, they could proceed without further obstacles to Jerusalem. Although overland travel was slower than going by sea, it was far less costly and more convenient, particularly for those traveling in large groups. As long as pilgrims behaved respectfully, they could generally rely on warm hospitality from the peasants throughout the Byzantine Empire. Along the early stages of the journey, the Cluniac order had begun establishing hostels to assist travelers. In Italy, there were several hospices, some designated specifically for Norse pilgrims. A large and important hospice was located at Melk in Austria. In Constantinople, Western pilgrims were welcomed at the Hospice of Samson, and the Cluniacs also maintained a facility in Rodosto, situated in the outskirts of the city. In Jerusalem itself, accommodations were available at the Hospital of St. John, founded by merchants from Amalfi. Western nobles often traveled with armed escorts, which was acceptable provided the soldiers remained disciplined. Many pilgrims sought the safety of traveling with such groups, although journeying alone or in small numbers was not unusual, nor especially dangerous. At times, however, there were complications. During periods of persecution under Hakim, it became uncomfortable to remain in Palestine for extended periods, though the influx of pilgrims never fully ceased. In 1055, the frontier leading into Muslim-controlled territory was considered unsafe. Lietbert, the bishop of Cambrai, was denied permission to exit Laodike by the local governor and was forced to detour to Cyprus. A year later, in 1056, Muslim authorities barred Westerners from entering the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and expelled around 300 of them from Jerusalem. There were also incidents that caused offense within the Byzantine Empire. Both Emperor Basil II and his successor, Empress Theodora, incurred criticism for directing customs officials to impose taxes on pilgrims and their horses. In response, Pope Victor II wrote to the Empress in late 1056, urging her to revoke the decree. His letter implied that imperial tax collectors were even operating in Jerusalem itself. Despite these occasional setbacks, such disruptions were uncommon. Throughout most of the 11th century, until its final decades, a continuous flow of travelers headed east. These pilgrims came in groups that sometimes numbered in the thousands, ready to spend a year or more on the journey in the unhurried spirit of the time. Many would pause in Constantinople to marvel at the immense city, which dwarfed anything they had seen in the West, and to venerate the sacred relics it held. Among the treasures were the crown of thorns, the seamless garment, and many of the Passion's most revered relics. Pilgrims could behold the cloth from Edessa bearing the image of Christ's face, a portrait of the Virgin attributed to St. Luke, the hair of John the Baptist, the mantle of Elijah, and the bodies of countless saints, prophets, and martyrs. From there, the pilgrims would journey on to Palestine, visiting sacred sites such as Nazareth, Mount Tabor, the River Jordan, Bethlehem, and the numerous shrines in Jerusalem. At each stop, they prayed and paid their respects. Afterward, they undertook the long return trip, spiritually uplifted and transformed. Upon arriving home, they were honored by their communities as pilgrims of Christ who had completed the holiest of voyages. However, the pilgrimage experience relied on two essential conditions. First, there needed to be peace and stability in Palestine to ensure the safety of unarmed travelers. Second, the route to the Holy Land had to remain accessible and affordable. These requirements depended on two major factors: good governance and order in the Muslim world, and the continued prosperity and goodwill of the Byzantine Empire. By the middle of the 11th century, the Eastern Mediterranean enjoyed a period of apparent stability that seemed likely to endure. The two dominant powers in the region maintained cordial relations. Neither pursued expansionist aims, and both were keen to restrain the Muslim states further east, where Turkish adventurers were beginning to cause unrest. However, these disturbances had yet to cause real concern in either Constantinople or Cairo. The Fatimids maintained a friendly stance toward Christians. Since the death of Caliph Hakim, persecution had ceased, and Egyptian ports had been opened to merchants from Byzantium and Italy. Both traders and pilgrims benefited from this hospitable environment. This peaceful state was underpinned by the strength of the Byzantine Empire. A succession of formidable military emperors had expanded its reach from the shores of the Lebanon to the banks of the Danube, and from Naples to the Caspian Sea. Despite occasional corruption and sporadic unrest, the empire was administered more efficiently than any other kingdom of its time. Constantinople had reached an unparalleled level of prosperity. It was the world's leading center of commerce and finance. Merchants from Italy, Germany, Russia, Egypt, and the East converged upon the city to purchase its fine manufactured goods and to barter their own more rustic products. The sheer scale and liveliness of the city left visitors awestruck. Even though the imperial court was currently overseen by two eccentric elderly princesses, it remained, to outside observers, the very heart of the universe. If art reflects the soul of a civilization, then Byzantine culture was flourishing. 11th century artists upheld the classical ideals of harmony and restraint while blending in two elements from Eastern traditions: the ornate stylization of Persian art and the spiritual depth of the ancient Near East. Whether in small ivory carvings, vast mosaic compositions, or rural churches like those at Daphne or Hosios Lukis in Greece, the art of this era demonstrated a masterful fusion of diverse influences into a unified whole. The literature of the period, though somewhat constrained by the enduring influence of classical models, was remarkably varied and of high quality. Among the preserved works are the refined history of John Diaconus, the lyrical poetry of Christopher of Mytilene, the sweeping folk epic of Digenis Acritas, the pragmatic sayings of the soldier Secominus, and the sharp, satirical memoirs of Michael Sellis. The mood of the era evoked something of the self-confidence of the 18th century, though it was tinged with a spiritual detachment and a lingering pessimism that Byzantium could never fully shake. The Greek character was intricate and elusive, far more complex than the idealized portrayals offered by popular interpreters of the 5th century BC. The Byzantine Greek, shaped further by the influence of Eastern ancestry, exhibited even greater contradictions. He was remarkably pragmatic, adept in commerce, and drawn to worldly honors. Yet he was equally inclined to abandon secular life in pursuit of monastic solitude. He held a deep belief in the divine mission of the empire and the sacred authority of the emperor, while at the same time displaying a fiercely independent spirit, quick to challenge a government that displeased him. Though he viewed heresy with deep suspicion, his religion allowed significant philosophical freedom to both clergy and laity. He considered his neighbors to be uncultured barbarians, yet he readily adopted their customs and ideas. For all his refinement and pride, he often lacked emotional steadiness. Byzantium had narrowly escaped catastrophe many times, eroding his trust and stability. In moments of sudden crisis, he could succumb to panic and commit acts of cruelty that would have appalled him in calmer times. Even during periods of peace and prosperity, he remained haunted by countless prophecies predicting the fall of his city. For him, lasting peace and happiness were not to be found in this fleeting world, but only in the eternal kingdom of heaven. These fears were not unfounded. The foundations of Byzantine strength were never entirely secure. The empire's structure was fundamentally defensive. Its provinces were administered by military governors, who were themselves supervised by the civil bureaucracy in Constantinople. This arrangement produced an effective local militia capable of protecting regional territories during invasions and supporting the central army in major campaigns. However, in times of peace, it conferred excessive authority on provincial governors. Moreover, the empire's growing affluence was undermining the agrarian system in Asia Minor. Byzantium had long relied on communities of freeholding peasants, who often exchanged military service for land granted directly by the state. But, as throughout the medieval world, land was the most secure form of wealth. The wealthy sought to expand their estates, and the church encouraged devout followers to donate land. Land was also a common reward for military leaders and high-ranking officials. While the expansion of the empire or the repopulation of ravaged regions had temporarily concealed the dangers, prosperity itself fueled an insatiable demand for land. Nobles and monasteries increasingly acquired property by purchasing plots from peasants in need of money, or by assuming control over entire villages. More prudent emperors attempted to curb this trend, knowing that large landowners often prioritized profits from sheep farming over crop cultivation, and that the loss of peasant soldiers' land to aristocrats weakened the state's military capacity while enabling magnates to raise their own private forces. Yet these laws ultimately failed. By the 10th century, a powerful, land-owning hereditary aristocracy had taken shape in Byzantium, with enough influence and wealth to challenge imperial authority. Emperor Basil II, one of the most formidable rulers of the Macedonian dynasty, faced and overcame a rebellion by this aristocracy early in his reign. His victory secured his prestige, which endured until the dynasty's end in 1056, upon the death of his niece, Empress Theodora. Had the Macedonian line produced male heirs, it is likely the imperial throne would have passed through hereditary succession, giving the state a stronger mechanism for containing aristocratic power. Nonetheless, dynastic loyalty allowed Empress Zoe and her various husbands to govern with careless extravagance for nearly 3 decades, and later enabled the elderly Theodora to rule alone. Yet beneath this surface stability, internal divisions intensified. Upon Theodora's death, the empire stood divided between 2 opposing factions: the court elite, which managed the central administration, and the aristocratic families who dominated the military. Meanwhile, the church, with allegiances in both camps, attempted to mediate and maintain a precarious balance of power. Barely had the 70-year-old empress slipped into her final coma when the court moved swiftly to place an elderly bureaucrat, Michael Stratioticus, on the throne. However, the army refused to recognize him. Marching on Constantinople with clear intentions, the soldiers demanded their commander be crowned. Michael abdicated without resistance, and General Isaac Comnenus was proclaimed emperor. The military aristocracy had claimed its first victory. Isaac Comnenus, like many of the Byzantine nobility, was only a second-generation aristocrat. His father, a soldier from Thrace, had caught the attention of Basil II, who rewarded him with lands in Paphlagonia. There he built a fortress known as Castra Comnenion, still referred to today as Kastamuni. Isaac and his brother John inherited their father's estate and martial skills, and both strengthened their social positions by marrying into established aristocratic families. Isaac was a Bulgarian princess from the former royal house, while John married an heiress for the powerful Dalasinos family. Despite his wealth, authority, and military backing, Isaac's rule was constantly obstructed by the entrenched hostility of the civil bureaucracy. After 2 years of mounting frustration, he renounced power and entered a monastery. With no son to inherit the throne, he named Constantine Ducas as his successor. Constantine Ducas came from one of the oldest and wealthiest aristocratic families in Byzantium. However, his rise to prominence had occurred within the imperial court rather than on the battlefield. Isaac had hoped that Constantine would bridge the divide between the military and the bureaucracy. Yet Constantine quickly revealed his preference for the latter. Confronted with an empty treasury and a politically dominant army, he chose to reduce the size of the armed forces. While this may have been reasonable as a domestic policy, it was dangerously short-sighted in a realm where military strength was essential. At no point in Byzantine history could a weakening of the empire's defense be considered safe. Trouble was brewing in the east, while conflict in the west had already erupted. For years, southern Italy had been a region of instability and confusion. Although the Byzantine Empire's frontier officially stretched from Terracina on the Tyrrhenian Sea to Termoli on the Adriatic, only the provinces of Apulia and Calabria were directly governed by Constantinople. These areas were predominantly Greek in population. Along the western coast, the 3 maritime republics remained nominal vassals of the emperor. Among them, Amalfi maintained an active trade with the Muslim East and valued the emperor's favor in dealings with the Fatimid rulers. They even kept a permanent consul in Constantinople. Meanwhile, Naples and Gaeta, though equally engaged in trade with Muslim merchants, were less deferential toward the Byzantine throne. Inland, the region was controlled by the Lombard princes of Benevento and Salerno, who alternated their allegiance between the Eastern and Western empires, while showing little respect to either. Sicily remained under Muslim control, despite repeated Byzantine efforts to reclaim the island. Raids from Sicily and North Africa along the southern Italian coasts further exacerbated the region's disorder and instability. Large numbers of Norman adventurers from northern France had made their way into these regions. Among them were numerous soldiers of fortune who decided to remain and offer their services to the Lombard princes. Normandy, with its densely populated lands, left little room for ambitious younger sons or knights without estates. This hunger for land and opportunity soon drove them not only to conquer England, but also to cast their gaze eastward, enticed by the wealth of the Mediterranean. Southern Italy, rife with turmoil, appeared to them as the gateway to such a realm. In 1040, 6 sons of a minor Norman knight, Tancred de Hauteville, captured the hill town of Melfi in Apulia and established a principality there. The Byzantine authorities in the region did not initially take them seriously. However, the Western Emperor Henry III and the German Pope he had appointed, who resented the influence of the Patriarch of Constantinople in Italy, both extended their support to the Normans. Within a mere 12 years, Tancred's sons had secured dominance over the Lombard states. They had forced the Byzantines to retreat to the southern tip of Calabria and a narrow stretch of the Apulian coast. Their forces threatened the western coastal cities, and they launched raids into Campania, reaching the outskirts of Rome. Alarmed by these developments, the Byzantine government recalled the governor of Apulia, Marianus Argerus, for consultation and sent him back with broader authority to restore order. Militarily, he achieved little. However, his diplomatic efforts bore more fruit. Pope Leo IX, a Lorrainer, also grew increasingly uneasy. The Normans' advances had far exceeded what he and Henry III had anticipated. Although Henry was then engaged in a campaign against Hungary, he dispatched reinforcements to support the Pope. In the summer of 1053, Leo set out with a combined force of Germans and Italians, declaring it a holy war. A contingent of Byzantine troops was expected to join him, but before their arrival, the Normans launched a surprise attack near the small Apulian town of Civitate. Leo's army was decisively defeated, and he himself was taken captive. In order to secure his release, he was forced to abandon his entire strategy. This marked the last major effort to restrain the sons of Tancred. Henry III died in 1056, leaving the throne to his young son, Henry IV. The regency, held by Agnes of Poitou, was preoccupied with affairs in Germany and paid little attention to the south. The papacy chose to adopt a pragmatic approach. In 1059, at the Council of Melfi, Pope Nicholas II formally acknowledged Robert Guiscard as Duke of Apulia and Calabria by the grace of God and St. Peter, and with their help, of Sicily. Rome viewed this title as implying vassalage to the papacy, though Robert did not share that interpretation. This recognition allowed the Normans to complete their conquest with relative ease. The coastal city-states quickly submitted, and by 1060, the Byzantines retained only their stronghold at Bari on the Adriatic coast. Meanwhile, Robert's younger brother, Roger, had begun the gradual but effective campaign to wrest Sicily from Arab control. As long as Bari remained under Byzantine control, it served as a barrier to further Norman expansion eastward. However, the political instability in Italy soon gave rise to religious tensions as well. The arrival of Latin conquerors in southern Italy reignited the issue of the Greek Church's presence in the region and revived the long-standing dispute between Constantinople and Rome regarding ecclesiastical authority. Reform efforts in Rome had strengthened the papacy's resolve to make no concessions on matters of doctrine or jurisdiction. Meanwhile, the patriarchal throne in Constantinople was held by Michael Cerularius, one of the most assertive and ambitious leaders the Greek Church had ever seen. The unfortunate events surrounding the mission of Pope Leo IX's legates to Constantinople in 1054 must be viewed within the broader context of ongoing tensions between the Eastern and Western churches. Their visit ended in mutual excommunications, despite the emperor's efforts to broker a settlement. This effectively prevented any meaningful collaboration between Rome and Constantinople regarding the immediate challenges in Italy. Still, it did not mark the definitive schism that later historians would attribute to it. Although diplomatic ties between the imperial courts were strained, they were not severed. Cerularius's power soon waned. After being rebuffed by Empress Theodora and later removed from office by Emperor Isaac, he died in exile, stripped of influence. Yet in time his legacy endured. Later generations in Byzantium came to regard him as a defender of their ecclesiastical and national autonomy. Even during a period of renewed correspondence and goodwill between the emperor and the pope, his memory was honored. His niece, Empress Eudocia Macrimbolitissa, successfully promoted his canonization. According to contemporary Byzantine chroniclers, the dispute received little attention from the empire's rulers. In their view, the challenges coming from the east far outweighed the troubles in the west. The weakening of the Abbasid Caliphate did not entirely work in Byzantium's favor. As Iraq fell into deeper poverty, global trade routes began to shift. Merchants from the far east no longer brought their goods to the bustling markets of Baghdad. Instead, traders started preferring the Red Sea route, bringing their merchandise to Egypt, from where Italian merchant vessels carried it onward to Europe. As a result, Byzantium no longer stood at the crossroads of east-west commerce. In addition, disorder in the outer regions of the Abbasid Empire led to the decline of the ancient caravan route stretching from China through Turkestan and northern Persia to Armenia and the port city of Trebizond. The alternate northern route, which passed above the Caspian Sea, remained unstable and insecure. For both political and commercial reasons, the Abbasid Caliphate had once served the Mediterranean world well, acting as a buffer against the nomadic tribes of Central Asia. With that protective barrier gone, Central Asia was once again free to erupt into the lands of ancient civilization. Turks have played a notable role in history for centuries. In the 6th century, the Turkish Empire had briefly brought order and cultural development to Asia. Even remote Turkish groups like the Jewish Khazars of the Volga and the Christian historian Uyghurs near China had shown adaptability and an openness to culture. But within Turkestan itself, there had been little progress since the 7th century. Though a few cities sprang up along the trade routes, most of the Turkoman population remained pastoral and semi-nomadic. Their increasing numbers pushed them to seek new territories beyond their homeland. By the 10th century, Turkestan was under the rule of the Persian Samanid dynasty, best remembered for converting many Central Asian Turks to Islam. This religious shift redirected Turkish ambitions towards Southwest Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean. The Samanids were eventually overthrown by Mahmud of Ghazni, the first major Turkish Muslim ruler. In the early 11th century, he built a powerful empire that stretched from Isfahan through Bokhara to Lahore. At the same time, Turkish mercenaries were making their way across the Islamic world, in much the same way that Normans were infiltrating Christian Europe. Turkish military units served the Caliph in Baghdad, as well as various other Muslim leaders. Among Mahmud's subjects was a tribe of Guz Turks from the Aral region known as the Seljuks, named after a semi-legendary ancestor. These Seljuk princes were a band of ambitious rivals, working together to promote their family's influence. But unlike the Normans, who were relatively few in number, the Seljuks could call on vast, roaming Turkoman tribes for reinforcements. After Mahmud's death in 1030, the Seljuks rebelled against the Ghaznavids. By 1040, they had forced their former rulers to retreat to their holdings in India. In 1050, Tughril Bey, the senior Seljuk leader, captured Isfahan and made it the capital of a new realm that encompassed Persia and Khorasan. His brothers and cousins spread out to the north, forming a loose federation that accepted his authority while conducting raids into neighboring lands. In 1055, responding to a request from the Abbasid Caliph Tughril, marched into Baghdad. He arrived as the defender of Sunni Islam and was proclaimed sovereign over both East and West. From that point onward, he wielded supreme temporal power across all the territories that recognized the spiritual authority of the Caliph. Turkish incursions into Armenia had begun as early as the reign of Basil II, during a time when the Seljuks were still under the authority of the Ghaznavids. To defend his empire from these threats, Basil initiated a strategy of gradually annexing Armenian territory. After the Seljuks gained control of Persia, the frequency of their raids increased. Tughril Bey personally led just one such expedition in 1054, during which he laid waste to the region around Lake Van, but failed to capture the fortress at Manzikert. Most raids were led by his relatives, Asin and Ibrahim Ainul. In 1047, they suffered a defeat at the hands of the Byzantines near Erzurum, after which they shifted focus to attacking the empire's Georgian allies. In 1052, Kars was plundered. In 1056 and 1057, Armenian lands were struck again. Melitene fell in 1057, and by 1059, Turkish forces had penetrated deep into imperial territory, reaching as far as Sebastia. Tughril Bey died in 1063, having shown little personal concern for his empire's northwestern frontier. However, his nephew and successor, Alp Arslan, wary of a potential alliance between the Byzantines and the Fatimids, sought to neutralize the Byzantine threat by conquering Armenia before turning his attention to the Fatimids. The raids intensified. In 1064, the ancient Armenian capital of Ani was razed, and the Prince of Kars surrendered his lands to the emperor in exchange for estates in the Taurus Mountains. Many Armenians followed him into imperial territory. From 1065 onward, the strategic fortress city of Edessa came under repeated annual attacks. However, the Turks still lacked proficiency in siege warfare. In 1066, they seized control of the Amanus mountain passes and, the following spring, pillaged Caesarea, the major city of Cappadocia. That winter, Byzantine forces were defeated at both Melitene and Sebastia, losses that effectively handed the Turks control over Armenia. In the subsequent years, they raided extensively into Byzantine territory. Faced with a rapidly deteriorating situation, the imperial government was compelled to act. Constantine X, whose policy of weakening the military had greatly contributed to the crisis, had died in 1067, leaving his young son, Michael VII, under the regency of his mother, Empress Eudocia. In the following year, Eudocia married the army's commander-in-chief, Romanus Diogenes, elevating him to the imperial throne. Romanus was a capable soldier and a committed patriot, but the enormity of the task required extraordinary talent. He recognized that the empire's survival depended on reclaiming Armenia. Yet the Byzantine military no longer resembled the formidable force it had once been. Provincial units were insufficient even for local defense and could not be spared for an imperial campaign. The aristocracy, from whom troops might have been raised, remained aloof and distrustful. The elite cavalry, which had once numbered 60,000 and guarded the Syrian frontier, had been disbanded. The imperial guard, composed of elite Anatolian troops, had greatly declined in numbers and effectiveness. The army now consisted largely of foreign mercenaries, Norsemen from the Varangian Guard, Normans and Franks from Western Europe, Slavs from the north, and Turkic warriors from the southern Russian steppes, including Pecheneg, Cumans, and Guz Turks. From this disparate mix, Romanus assembled an army of nearly 100,000 men. Perhaps half were native Byzantines, but few were professional soldiers, and even fewer were properly equipped. Among the mercenaries, the Cumans formed the largest contingent. The elite forces were the heavy cavalry units made up of Franks and Normans, commanded by the Norman Roussel of Balliol. Previous commanders, such as Hervé and Crispin, had been dismissed for outright treason, and the troops insisted on being led by one of their own. The main Byzantine commander under Romanus was Andronicus Ducas, a nephew of the late emperor and a staunch opponent of Romanus. The emperor, wary of his enmity, felt he could not leave him behind in Constantinople. With this large but unreliable force, Romanus embarked on a campaign to reclaim Armenia in the spring of 1071. Just as he was departing the capital, word arrived from Italy. Bari had fallen to the Normans. The chroniclers recount with sorrowful detail the emperor's march eastward along the main Byzantine military highway. His objective was to seize and fortify the Armenian strongholds before the Turkish forces could advance from the south. At the time, Alp Arslan was in Syria, near Aleppo, when news reached him of the Byzantine movement. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he rushed north to confront the emperor. Romanus entered Armenia by the southern branch of the upper Euphrates. Near the city of Manzikert, he divided his army. He proceeded to massacre himself, while dispatching the Frankish and Cuman contingents to capture the fortress of Aklat, located on the shores of Lake Van. Soon after reaching Manzikert, he learned that Alp Arslan was approaching. In response, he turned southwest in an effort to reunite his forces before the Turks could arrive. However, in a critical error, he failed to observe a fundamental rule of Byzantine military strategy. He did not send out scouts. On Friday, August 19th, while Romanus was camped in a valley along the road to Aklat awaiting the return of his mercenaries, Alp Arslan launched a surprise attack. The mercenaries never came to his aid. The Cumans, who shared ethnic ties with the Turks and were dissatisfied over unpaid wages, had defected the night before to join Alp Arslan. Meanwhile, Roussel and his Franks chose to abstain from the battle altogether. The outcome was quickly determined. Romanus fought with courage, but Andronicus Ducas withdrew the reserve troops under his command and began a retreat westward, abandoning the emperor. By nightfall, the Byzantine army was annihilated, and Romanus was wounded and taken prisoner.